Committee. In addition to his position as a research affiliate in MIT's program in Science, Technology, and Society, he's currently a visiting professor at the Tokyo Institute of Technology. On our website listing for the program, there's a link to a recent paper on missile defense written by Subrata, published in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Subrata will now introduce our guest, Dr. Heidi Peltier. Heidi, thank you for being here, and thank you, Subrata.
Thank you, Trish, for once again a kind introduction. And but before I introduce Heidi and make just a few initial remarks, I want to thank the Radius program, the Technology and Culture Forum at MIT, with Trish Weinman, Christina English, and Fia Keith Lucas, who have been instrumental in making this seminar series possible, and their help is priceless. In addition to them, I also have support from my own program at MIT, which is the Science, Technology, and Society. And Jennifer Light, who's the head of the program, has provided some financial support and moral encouragement to take on this very ambitious project. So thank you very much to all of them. As I said, before I introduce Heidi, our speaker today, I want to just say a few things about this work that she's doing is so close to my heart. And it is a pity that I have not been, was in contact with her. And I want to thank Professor Robert Pollen at perhaps Heidi's former advisor at University of Massachusetts Amherst, who recommended Heidi Peltier to me, and it worked beautifully. So, but here are just some comments I want to make before this to set the stage. The US budget deficit you have seen in the last few days that made the headlines in major newspapers has now reached $3.1 trillion. $3.1 trillion. Let that sink in the fiscal year that just ended on September 30th. This is by far the biggest one-year gap in US budget. In the budget, which is about, and Heidi will talk at length about this, but I want to just put the context that the federal budget is about $4 trillion. And within that budget, there is about $1.3 trillion, which is called the discretionary budget, which is subject to debate in Congress and annual appropriation. The others are mandatory program. So you have 1.3 billion, which is discretionary out of the 4 trillion. And so you now see the budget deficit of $3.1 trillion, which is more than twice the annual discretionary budget. I mean, talking about living in borrowed money. I mean, twice the budget is now our deficit. And, and this is not just due to the COVID. The deficit last year itself was $1 trillion. So now it's of course grown to 3.1 due to the due to the major program, the two stimulus. And but apart from the deficit, something else we forget, which is the national debt. I mean, how we are financing this deficit spending is we are borrowing money. So that is the national debt. And the national debt has been growing. And now I'm sure, and Heidi knows all about it, she's a trained economist, that it has gone beyond the annual GDP of the United States, which is about $23 trillion. That's the national debt. And it doesn't come for free because we have to pay interest on that debt. And Heidi's data shows now that is reaching about $1 trillion. $1 trillion now a year to pay for the interest on the debt, if I am correct. And but you wouldn't know that this is going on. The president is saying that the economy is humming, the stock market is at 28,000, then the Dow, and jobs are coming back, et cetera, et cetera. And look at the real data on the ledger, on the deficit side. And Congress doesn't know this either, because how can the Congress, which cannot come to an agreement about a stimulus that contains some help for the people of this country, majority people in this country, can go on spending $740 billion for the military? 740. That is $8 billion in addition to what the president asked. Even somebody like Trump, who has been upping the defense budget from Bush to Trump, this is just keep on going. And he asked for $732 billion, and Congress said, okay, we'll give you some more, we'll give you a tip. That's $740 billion. And we don't have money to spend for our healthcare. We don't have money for unemployment. And so to talk about all of this, we have, of course, today a great speaker and a scholar, Dr. Heidi Peltier, and she's the director of the project called Costs of War at Boston University's Pardee Center for the Study of Longer Range Future. She's also an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at BU. Heidi earned her PhD from that great economics department, the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And her expertise is primarily in military and domestic public sector spending, green growth, environmental economics, and energy policy. All are so relevant in the next year once you have a more democratic election and a new president, probably. Her research has included the impact of unemployment that is so critical on the different types of domestic spending, including the military spending and the green jobs, etc. She is the author of the book, Creating a Clean Energy Economy: How Investments in Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Can Create Jobs in Sustainable Economy. Her latest publication is The Growth of the Camo Economy, which is the camouflage economy, and the commercialization of the post-9/11 wars, which is basically the thrust of our talk today. What also impressed me so much about Heidi is, and that is very complementary to the kind of work I do regarding military spending, R&D spending, the inside things about how things work in the Beltway, is that Heidi has developed a quantitative methodology to estimate the impacts of spending on various domestic programs. Because one of the major issues about converting from a military-based economy, war-based economy, to a peace-based economy that will have jobs for environment, for clean energy, and so forth, is that it is impossible to convince the members of Congress that we need to do that and still create jobs that are in greater numbers than the current jobs the military-industrial complex has in all these companies like Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed, etc. So her work is very, very important, and I hope we have future collaborative effort on this. So with that, Heidi Peltier.
Thank you so much, Subrata. I want to thank Subrata for inviting me to speak and for that lovely introduction, and for putting my presentation in context to what's happening with the federal budget overall. And thanks as well to Trish for hosting, and for the other folks at Radius at MIT. So I'm going to start sharing my slides here. I'll bring them up. Oh, give me 1 second to put this into presentation mode. Okay. Okay, so can everyone see that okay? Hopefully. So the presentation I'm giving today is called The Bang in the Bucks, Post-9/11 Military Spending and the Shortchanging of Other Urgent Needs. I want to make a small correction to what Subrata said in his introduction. My title is the director of the 20 Years of War project, which is part of the Cost of War project, which started in 2010 at Brown University and has now expanded as well to Boston University. So the Cost of War project is at Brown in Boston, and I'm the director of a part of that project called the 20 Years of War project. And I'm a research fellow at the Frederick Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future at BU. So looking at military spending, what I want to do is put this into context, both in terms of the rest of the world and in terms of non-military spending in the federal budget in the US. So this data here is from SIPRI. It is global spending in 2019 on the military budget, comparing the US military spending and spending in other countries. And as you can see, US military spending accounts for more than the next 10 countries combined. We have 4.5% of global population, and we spend 38% of global military spending. We spend in the US 3 times as much as China and 10 times as much as India or Russia. Let me make one small thing here, okay. There we go. If we look just in relation to federal spending on defense and non-defense, budget authority in fiscal year 2020 for the Department of Defense was $721 billion, which represents about 15% of all federal spending. And that's federal spending, both mandatory and discretionary spending. And I just want to point out, I'm not sure what people's familiarity is with federal budgeting, but the budget authority you can think of as the money in the checkbook, and outlays as actually writing the check. So that the amount that the Department of Defense was entitled to spend in 2020 was $721 billion. If we compare that to other functions, the Office of Management and Budget categorizes different budget functions. Defense as a budget function is 48 times as much as federal spending on general science and basic research. It's 15 times as much as natural resources and conservation, and 3.7 times as much as we spend on education, training, and social services. If we look just at discretionary spending, defense now accounts for more than half of all discretionary spending. And that category includes various types of education spending, transportation, some healthcare spending as well. And more than half of all discretionary spending is for defense. Now that is looking at defense in the narrowest sense of the term. We can take a slightly broader way of classifying defense. And so what's shown here in this graph is from the US Bureau of Economic Analysis. The graph was compiled by Fred, by the St. Louis Federal Reserve. And this is national defense consumption and consumption expenditures and gross investment. And what that does is add not only, it includes not only the DoD budget, but also defense related activities. So these include the atomic activities in the Department of Energy and some other defense-related categories in other agencies. One example is defense-related expenses in the FBI. So if we look at that, instead of talking about $720 billion, the estimate in the second quarter of 2020 was $878 billion. So about $150 billion higher if we take this more expansive view of defense spending. And that's more than twice as much what defense spending was in 2001. If we break out the annual growth, defense spending over this period since 2001 grew by about 4% per year. Meanwhile, GDP grew 2% per year, half as much as defense spending grew annually. We can take now a slightly more expansive view of what we spend on the military. And there are some organizations that are calculating, estimating what they are terming a militarized budget. So the National Priorities Project, the Project on Government Oversight, for example, POGO estimates that our militarized budget is $1.25 trillion. So we start with the DoD budget of 720 billion, 721, add atomic activities in DOE and other defense spending, then add veterans benefits and services, which is over 200 billion a year, add security, homeland security, which is roughly 70 billion a year, intelligence across various agencies, plus the cost of public debt attributable to military spending. So adding all those categories, we get over $1 trillion, some estimate it to be 1.5 trillion of military spending or militarized spending. So I want to talk about two main reasons why US military spending is so high. And these aren't the only two, but they're certainly two of the main reasons. So first is spending on the post 9/11 wars, what we used to call the global war on terror. And at least for budgeting purposes, it's no longer called the global war on terror. But we at the Cost of War Project refer to these as the post 9/11 wars, starting in Afghanistan in 2001 and now including many other countries. So cumulative total spending and obligations, and I'll come back to this number, as of November 2019 was 6.4 trillion spent on the post 9/11 wars. And then the second main reason anyway, that military spending is as high as it is military contracting. Last year, or I guess we just closed a fiscal year. So the previous fiscal year, 2019, military contracting was $370 billion, which is more than half of all discretionary defense spending. And the material that I'll talk about when I talk about contracting today is almost exclusively drawn from a paper that came out in June of this year that I wrote called The Growth of the Camo Economy and the Commercialization of the Post 9/11 Wars. And I just want to mention that the slides for this talk will be available through Radius as well as through Pardee. And the papers that I mentioned in the talk are linked, and so you can access any of these sources if you get the slides after the presentation. So looking at this is actually a table from a paper I wrote in January 2020, or that came out in January 2020, called the Cost of Debt Financed War, and that looked at how much debt we're incurring and how what is the cost of the interest obligations of that war debt. And so I'm showing this I'm showing this table here to look at two things. One is to look at the annual and cumulative war spending, and the other is to look at cumulative interest. So if you look at the second to left column, that shows our annual war spending, not all defense spending, just war spending, which at some points was called emergency spending, at some points called spending on the global war on terror, and then starting in 2009, it's called OCO, Overseas Contingency Operations. So you can see that rose till a peak of 2008, which is when there was a troop surge, and then came back down, but is still in last year was $75 billion. Cumulative war spending up to 2019, that's circled in the middle column, was over $2 trillion. And then cumulative interest on that war spending is nearly an additional $1 trillion. So about 3 trillion, even if we stop spending on the post 9/11 wars completely as of this moment, we will continue to accrue interest. And by 2030, the interest payments on the war debt will equal what we've already spent on the war. So by 2030, that's $2 trillion that we will spend just on interest, climbing to 6.5 trillion in 2050. So this is a table drawn from Nita Crawford's paper that came out in November 2019. She has published, Nita Crawford is co-director of the Cost of War Project and the chair of political science at Boston University. And she's published an annual update of the US budgetary costs and obligations of the post 9/11 wars. And as of last fall, it was already up to 6.4 trillion. That's 5.4 trillion already spent, and another trillion or more that will be obligated to spend for veterans care. So that's about 2 trillion, looking at the first two lines, about 2 trillion in overseas contingency operations, nearly $1 trillion in interest. And then war-related spending in the base budget. So this shows up in two different ways. One is you can look at the base budget, which is the Defense Department budget in peacetime. You can estimate the differences in the base budget from peacetime and wartime. And so those differences come out to about 800 billion. And then there's a loophole that defense has used to get around some of the budget caps. The budget sequestration that was put in place in 2011 put limits on both defense and non-defense spending. But defense spending grew in a number of ways. One of those was by using OCO, overseas contingency operations, which is not subject to the budget caps because they're considered emergency appropriations. They're not subject to the caps. So OCO spending was used to circumvent those caps. And as of the past 2 years, there's actually a new category explicit in the budget, in the Defense Department budget documents, called OCO for base. So there's a recognition that there's funding for the base, for the Pentagon, that's being funded through OCO appropriations that are not subject to budget caps. So that was about 100 billion, medical and disability care, 400 and change, and then Homeland Security spending over $1 trillion. So looking at all of those combined, total war appropriations and war-related spending through 2020 was 5.4 trillion, and including future obligations to those veterans, the soldiers that are serving now or have already served in the post-9/11 wars, that brings us up to 6.4 trillion. So I want to move now into the second reason, which is contract spending. And this is a chart I put together using data from USA Spending on contracts through the Department of Defense from 2001 to 2019. And if I updated it, the most recent number would actually be a little bit greater than what we saw in 2019. I think it's up to about 390 billion now. But you can see that contracts went from 140 billion in 2001 to a high of 380 billion in 2008, dip down and back up, and now we're actually beyond. We're at a new high in the most recent data. And these are contracts for all types of things. They're not only procurement of weapon systems and the sort of traditional contracting that DoD used to do, but it's increasingly for services, which I'll talk about, well, now actually. So services, if you look at the middle pink area, contracted services, have grown since 2001 until this chart cuts off at 2016. This was compiled by the Defense Business Board, and contracted services now make up 24% of the DoD budget. The top dark purple area includes weapon system procurement and many other types of contracts. Some of that, it's not neatly all contract spending in that top portion. Some of that is in-house spending, and some of that is contract spending. And if you look at the bottom two slices, military personnel and civilian personnel, those have grown much less. The spending on those, the personnel costs has grown much less than the spending on contracted services and on procurement and other spending like that. Looking at USA Spending data on contracts just in Afghanistan, there 62% of the contracts whose place of performance was Afghanistan were for services. So what drives the Camo economy? In my paper, I talk about 3 different reasons. And these, of course, are not completely neatly separable. There's some overlap between these, but I think of these as the ideological factors, the political factors, and the economic factors. So the ideological driver is the promise of cost savings and efficiency through market competition. So you see this push, especially in the 70s and 80s, toward more privatization of government services, government production, under the promise that market competition will bring down costs, will increase quality, that government operates as a monopoly and is inefficient, but private markets would do better than that. So that's one driver, one set of drivers. The second set of drivers is political. This is the political savings of using contractors. And this is one of the reasons I call contracting the Camo economy, because it camouflages how much we spend, where that spending goes, and how many people are going to war and how many are coming back dead or injured. So the deaths of US contractors outnumber the deaths of US troops. And this is a statistic drawn from a cost of war publication last December, I think it was, or maybe November, on the human toll of the post 9/11 wars. So contractor deaths receive neither the public recognition nor the same kind of financial support as deaths of US troops. So this is one way to hide the casualties of war. It also hides how many people are actually going to war zones. So historically, contractors have always been fewer in number than troops. And by 2001, that ratio had gotten to about 1 to 1. By 2019, the ratio of contractors to troops got up to 1.5 to 1, and it's continuing to rise. And one notable thing I'll point out is that as troops are withdrawn from some of the Middle Eastern countries and post 9/11 war areas, as troops are withdrawn, contractors are withdrawing more slowly. So that ratio of contractors to troops is actually growing. The third set of drivers is an economic set of drivers. And this relates a bit to Say's law, which is known as supply creating its own demand. And so in the drawdown from the Cold War, you have excess supplies, excess manufacturing capacity, excess personnel. All of these need a new market. And so there are what I call two types of suppliers in this new market. The market opportunists, who are kind of the entrepreneurs, the new businesses that emerge to take on governments, to take on services, military services that had traditionally been performed by the military. And then the market makers, which are large established firms that have political connections and are able to find, to create new market opportunities through those connections. And I won't go into those drivers further, but I will mention that on November 19th, anybody who's interested in finding out more about contracting, I'm going to be giving a talk through the Pardee Center, which will focus on this Camo economy paper, and I can give information to that about that afterwards. So why is military contracting so expensive? Well, two main categories of reasons. First is that they are not the cost-saving private producers that we expected them to be, or we were told they would be. So the ideological justification for military contracting is that private competition in private markets would bring down cost and be better than public monopoly, essentially. But what we find is not private competition, but rather commercial monopoly. And I use the term commercial rather than using the term private because there's not much that's private about military contracting. It uses public dollars, taxpayer dollars, to serve a public purpose and is ostensibly under public oversight. So using the term privatization for me is not really applicable to this particular sector. So I prefer the term commercialization. So military contracting is more like a commercial monopoly. And there are various reasons why there's a lack of competition or a lack of cost reducing pressures. So first is the nature of the contracts themselves. So one issue is what are called cost type contracts. So government contracts of all types can be either cost type contracts or fixed price contracts. So fixed price, the contractor sets a price in the contract, and if they have any cost overruns, it's the contractor who bears that overage. And so the risk accrues to the contractor. The cost type contracts, on the other hand, extra costs are borne by the government. So in cost type contracts, the contractor is reimbursed for all reasonable costs and then usually some percentage or level of profit above that cost. So there's no incentive in a cost type contract for the contractor to keep costs low. All of those costs are just passed on to the government, passed on to the taxpayer. And if you look at DoD contracts compared to other departments in the federal government, DoD uses cost type contracts much more than other departments do. And over the past decade or so, about 30% of DoD contracts were cost type contracts totaling $1.2 trillion. So that's $1.2 trillion that was not subject in any way to cost reducing pressure. Then on the next is looking at non-competitive contracts. So there are various ways that contracts can be labeled as either competitive or non-competitive. And last year, well, in 2019, 45% of DoD contracts were non-competitive contracts. And there are various reasons that a contract can be listed as non-competitive. Either there's only one supplier, or if it's considered an urgent matter or a matter of national security, it can be the contract can be awarded without being competed. And this 45% in some ways is an underestimate, because even competitive contracts are sometimes competitive in name only, or are competitive in their first year and are renewed for multiple years. And even though they're not competed in those future years where they're renewed, they're still listed as competitive in the database. So looking at the database, we see that 45% are non-competitive, but the non-competitive percentage is actually higher than that in reality. And then a second category under this this set of reasons for lacking cost reducing pressures is lifetime contracts or sole supplier contracts. So you increasingly have contracts that are made where, let's say Lockheed Martin provides a weapon system, and then they have a lifetime contract to service that system, or they have a sole supplier contract to provide replacement parts for that system. So they essentially establish a monopoly for themselves, where even potentially the first round of the contract for the procurement of the good or provision of the good is competitive. Then there's a clause in the contract that gives them a monopoly on some part of supplying parts or services in the future. And then thirdly, we have de facto monopolies. So these are situations that arise especially in war zones, where contractors are building infrastructure or confronting high fixed or upfront costs, where it doesn't really make sense for contracts to be recompeted annually or regularly. The second set of reasons why military contracting is so expensive is the waste, the fraud, the abuse, and the excessive profits that happen in military contracting. So in some cases, this is from lack of oversight, too many dollars going out too quickly, especially at the beginning of wars or in surge situations. So the Afghanistan papers from the Washington Post, which were published last year, found lots of examples of this. Another issue is overbilling or billing for services never performed. So for example, there are federal government lawsuits against various contractors, including KBR, who was found to bill 136 meals for every 100 that they served. Other types of bribes and corruption, which are found regularly in the Inspector General reports in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the 2011 Commission on Wartime Contracting found that about 30%, or at least 30% of military contracting was wasteful, fraudulent, or in some cases getting into the hands of insurgents or people that we were there to fight. And then slightly separate from that is just the issue of the profitability of military contracting. So this is an incredibly lucrative industry. It's kept that way through political lobbying. Lockheed Martin, for example, and in some ways I don't want to pick on them. In another way, they get 10% of all federal contract dollars, and they earn 85% of their revenues for through government contracting. So I feel like maybe I should pick on them. They're the number one contractor in terms of dollars. So their contracting comes out to about, in recent years, $40 billion a year, and their average profit levels, or their annual profit levels, looking at their financial, their 10K reports, have been in the $4 to $8 billion range, steadily and quickly growing in recent years. So you have the profitability, and then you have the intersection of the profitability and the cost type contracts, where you have layers of contract that are building in layers of profit. So you have a prime contractor, a big contractor directly with the government, who subcontracts and further subcontracts and possibly further subcontracts, each contractor building in their own profit into their cost estimate. And so by the time that cost gets back to the federal government and to the taxpayer, it's many times more expensive than it would have been if the federal government, if the Department of Defense provided it themselves. So what are the budgetary implications? Well, I see two. That this excessive spending due to endless wars and the inflated military costs to contracting due to contracting lead essentially to two options if we keep the inflated military budget as it is. We can either cut non-military spending now and protect military spending without increasing the deficit, or we can increase public debt, which leads to greater interest payments, even greater lost opportunities based on those increased interest payments, which further hamstrings future choices and can result in bigger cuts to other programs in the future. So over the past 20 years, we've spent, at the narrowest way of conceiving it, we've spent $3 trillion on the post-9/11 wars. If we use Dr. Crawford's figures, we've spent $5.4 trillion already, and we're obligated to spend at least another $1 trillion, even if the wars ended right at this moment. So we can think about these 3 trillion or 5.4 trillion or 6.4 trillion and say, was this the best use of our funds? And so one way we can address that question is to look at the opportunity costs, including the lost opportunities to create jobs. And so if anybody's interested in the details of this, I can go into it in the Q&A, but I use an input-output model to estimate the direct and indirect jobs in any industry. Or it's possible to do it for any industry. In this case, I look at military spending, as well as clean energy spending, healthcare, education, and it's possible to do it for 500 plus industries to make these sorts of comparisons. And basically what it does is look at employment in the industry in question and employment throughout the supply chain. And we have the result is a jobs multiplier, where we say if we spend $1 million in an industry, how many jobs are created directly in that industry and indirectly throughout the supply chain. And this is a linear model, so $1 billion would create 1,000 times as many jobs. So military spending creates about 7 jobs per million. Clean energy and infrastructure create about 10 jobs per million, so about 40% more jobs than the military for the same level of spending. Healthcare supports over 14 jobs, education supports over 15 jobs, and if you look at just elementary and secondary education, the number's even greater. So that's 100% or 120% more than military spending if you spent the same amount in any of these other industries, or 100% more in healthcare and 120% more in education. And there are various reasons for this, and I won't get too much into this right now, but one of the main reasons is that the military is much more capital intensive, whereas industries like healthcare and education are more labor intensive. Another is that for military spending, there's more leakage or more overseas spending, whereas industries like clean energy, particularly retrofitting and energy efficiency, has a much higher domestic content. Infrastructure, same thing. Education, much higher domestic content. So by spending what I would describe as excessively on the military, we are losing opportunities to spend on other areas that are important to Americans. These include, the categories I just mentioned, and what I do here, if you look on the left hand in the table, you see that federal defense for, at the time I produced this table, it was March 2019, and I think the annual average spending was $260 billion, using the more expansive estimate provided by Dr. Crawford. So if you look at that came out to about $260 billion a year, which created about 1.8 million jobs in defense, or an average of clean energy would be about 2.5 million jobs. as you can see, elementary and secondary schools, almost 5 million jobs. And on the bottom line, if you average clean energy, education, infrastructure, healthcare, it's about 3.2 million jobs. So 3.2 million is what we could have created instead of the 1.8 million we did create. Same information is in the graph. If you look at the blue bar, that's the number of jobs that were created through federal defense. And if you look at the dashed line above those bars, those are the lost opportunities to create jobs in other industries. And I just want to mention, these aren't additive. You can look at any one of those bars and say, if we'd invested in this, how many would we have gotten instead of defense? So excessive military spending really is a lost opportunity to fund other urgent priorities, or we can look at it as cutting military spending gives us an opportunity to fund other urgent priorities. So in this COVID era that we find ourselves in, public debt has massively increased, as Subrata mentioned at the beginning. Public debt is now greater than GDP in the US. State budgets have shrunk, the costs of education have risen, and all of these can be addressed, of course not fully, but all of these can be addressed with cuts to the military budget and with withdrawal from the post-9/11 wars. So I'll give one example, which is to look at a 20% cut in DoD funding. So bringing DoD funding from roughly $750 billion a year to roughly $600 billion a year. Now, this isn't actually being discussed right now in Congress. The closest we saw was this past summer. There was a National Defense Authorization Act in which progressives were pushing for a 10% cut in DoD funding. But if we increase that to a 20% cut, we could double housing assistance, which is at about $100 billion now, and double food assistance. So looking at this chart here, this is budget authority by function from OMB, that's Office of Management and Budget, table 5.1. And I did leave some categories off of this because I didn't want it to be too unwieldy or crowded. So we can see defense spending. I don't know if you can see my cursor, I hope so. Defense spending on this top line. These are healthcare spending here, followed by interest. This is not just interest on defense spending, this is all interest on public debt, which will continue to climb. But this green line down here is the food and nutrition assistance at about 100 billion. And this blue line here is housing assistance. And these are two categories that are desperately needed by many people in poverty right now, who are either in poverty pre-COVID or have found themselves there in the COVID era. So both of these could be doubled by bringing defense spending from 750 down to 600 billion, which still puts it above all the other types of discretionary spending we have. And I'll also just reinforce that message that interest payments themselves are an enormous opportunity cost. So these are forecast to reach 10% of federal spending by 2030. This estimate was done a few months ago, or possibly even a year ago. So it's quite possible that now with the increase in deficit and debt that we've taken on this year, that it will be 10% of federal spending before 2030. That's 10% of federal dollars that are going just to pay off the interest on the debt. So that's an enormous opportunity cost. And if we would also end the post-9/11 wars and reduce other military expenditures, for example, by reducing contracting, we could further fund other priorities, or we could reduce the debt and related interest payments. So I'll stop the presentation there, and I will welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heidi, for as expected, wonderful, informative presentation. Of course, there are many, many numbers, so people probably have a little difficulty absorbing all these numbers, but the gist of the message is very, very clear, making the case that the opportunity cost of this excessive military spending. Before you go to Q&A, I want to also just add a point to this discussion, which is that the cost of war, the war is of course a two-sided event, and most of the time these are wars of aggression throughout the world, from Vietnam to Iraq to Korea to Libya to Yemen and everywhere. And in these wars, the costs that Heidi is talking about are the costs incurred by the US taxpayer money, and it affects the Americans, of course, in terrible ways. But the costs of these wars abroad are horrendous. I mean, there are countries that now lie totally in ruins in Iraq, in Libya, and so forth. These are the cradles of civilization from Mesopotamia and so forth. And so obviously, that's a much bigger project in terms of trying to assess this costs that are brought onto these other countries. So just looking at our own costs here in the United States, it's just mind-boggling. So I just throw that out, and then we can go. Heidi, if you want to make a comment on this or not, but no, we can go to Q&A.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment actually, because that relates to a couple other things, papers that were written by the Cost of War Project. The Cost of War Project has now, I think, more than 50 different scholars working from different institutions on different aspects of the cost of war, not just the budgetary aspects, but also the human toll. And so to get at what Subrata was just mentioning, the human cost was estimated last year to be over 800,000 lives lost since the beginning of the wars. Now, only 15,000 of those are in the US, right? I mentioned 8,000 contractors and 7,000 US troops. But worldwide, the estimate, which is very difficult to estimate, is something like 800,000, possibly more. And the other thing I'll mention is a paper just came out in September looking at displacement due to the US interventions in the post-9/11 areas. And that estimate was 37 million people displaced, some of those as refugees in other countries, some of those internally displaced. But I recommend to anyone interested in these issues to look at that paper, which is by David Vine and colleagues of his.
Thank you very much. That's very important information. Thank you. So Trish, do we have questions?
Yes. Someone is asking, what are the fundamental economic reason or reasons that military spending creates fewer jobs than spending on healthcare, education, etc.?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are essentially three. So again, the way that I've estimated military jobs compared to other types of jobs is using an input-output model. So this is looking at data reported by businesses, data through the economic census, through IRS records, and so on. So it's really a snapshot of the American economy and the interlinkages between the different businesses. So I just want to mention that as kind of where the job estimates come from. There are essentially three reasons why military spending creates fewer jobs than the other industries that I showed. One is labor intensity. That the amount of spending, if you take out of $1 million, what part of that $1 million goes towards labor versus what part goes towards plant and equipment. Military spending is much higher in capital cost, whereas an industry like education is much more labor intensive. So a much greater proportion of the spending goes toward hiring people in those other industries. The second would be domestic content. So out of the direct spending and the supply chain, how much of it is produced domestically in the US economy and how much of it is sourced from abroad or is spent abroad. And military spending has less domestic spending because of, partly it's because of spending that happens abroad, from soldiers spending their pay abroad, for example, but also a lot of the military contracting that we're seeing in the post-9/11 era that's increasingly service provision is being done not as much by US contractors, but more by host country or third country nationals. So these US taxpayer dollars are going to pay contractors from other countries. And so that lowers the job creation for the US economy. And then a third reason is the differences in pay. So on average, military pay, including all civilian and military personnel, on average, and notably, pay of contractors. So one of the things that I didn't talk about today is the wage premium paid at many military contracting firms. So looking at higher wages in the military and in military contractors, you get fewer jobs for the same amount of spending as you would in an industry like education, where wages are lower.
So, there's a follow-up to this question, and it's, why does capital spending produce fewer jobs than non-capital spending?
Partly it's just a matter of arithmetic, in the sense that if you know, I'm trying to think of an easy example, but if you to take the $1 million figure again, in the education industry, something like $700,000 out of that million goes to pay teachers and other staff in educational facilities, and 300,000 goes to pay, you know, school buildings and bus companies and other things where equipment is being used. Whereas in the military, it's, I don't remember what the proportion is, but it's less than half of that $1 million. So less than 500,000 would go to support people, and more than half would go to paying for the equipment. So paying for the vehicles, the ammunition, the fuel, and so on. And so if you imagine 700,000 being spent and how many people you can hire versus 500,000 being spent and how many people you can hire, it becomes at that point just a matter of arithmetic.
Thank you. An audience member is thanking you, Heidi, for this enlightening lecture, and then has a question. The primary objective of the DoD's excessive budget would be for R&D of advanced technology. There is a question mark after that sentence. And then defense industry is entirely reliant on DoD spending for their advanced technology R&D, I guess.
So I'm not entirely sure what that question means, and if I don't answer it, please feel free to follow up in the chat. But yes, DoD. So the R&D budget, if you look at any industry, R&D is much greater in the defense industry than it is in any other part of the federal budget. And the R&D budget of the Defense Department is well over $100 billion. There's no other R&D budget, and I forget the exact figure, Subrata might know the exact figure, but it's well over $100 billion. A lot of that is done through contractors. Some of that, so primarily contractors like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman. These are some of the big contractors that get R&D dollars. Some of the R&D is done through universities. Some of it is done through government labs. So some of it stays within government research facilities, but a lot of it is done by either outside firms or, in some cases, universities.
Maybe I will make a little comment, Heidi, on this R&D business. When I was on the staff at the House Armed Services Committee, my responsibility was to look at, from the Democratic staff, to look at the R&D budget of the military. At that time, it was like 55 billion. Now it's well over 100. But one of the strong arguments made, as I understood, maybe the questioner was hinting at, was that it is R&D. Yes, it is sold as research and development of science and technology. Who can be against that? And that is a primary selling point. And when the congressman approves and adds more money to these budgets, basically they're saying we're helping R&D. And top universities, even our own university, MIT, BU, Northeastern, Yale, and all these people used to send representatives to us, the congressional R&D staff, to argue for the money on the basic research, which is 6.1, and then some 6.2, which is applied research. And it is, so when you have these famous universities continuously arguing that we need the R&D budget, see, the members of Congress and their staff cannot make the distinction that in the name of R&D, what is really spent for scientific research that can be disseminated amongst scientists and publicly is very minuscule. 100 billion plus is the so-called R&D budget. The federal, the defense basic research budget is a little over $1 billion. And then the 6.2, which is applied research, is maybe a few more $1 billion. But the whole R&D budget is really focused on making prototypes, gizmos, and all this stuff where the companies get involved, not the universities, because the knowledge moves from university to the companies, and there many engineers are employed at very high salary levels and so forth. But all of it is lumped together just because the universities lobby for R&D, so the contractors don't have to, they can keep quiet because that whole thing is lumped together. And that has been my argument in Congress, outside Congress, that we need to take a look at this, what is going on in the name of scientific R&D, because most of the money does not produce any science or good technology like I have exposed in the missile defense program. And I'll just add one more thing to Heidi's talk, and that is Heidi mentioned there was $40 or so billion Lockheed Martin, which is 10% of federal contracting, going to one single company, and its profits are between $4 and $8 billion, which is 10 to 20%. In no industry, private, public, anywhere, you can make these kinds of profit. The cost plus cost plus programs, which are fixed fee, gives very generous fees like 10% and so to these companies for turning out hardware that often are very low quality. So there is all of that going on, is why this juggernaut is so difficult to stop.
Thank you, Subrata. Heidi, we have another gratitude to you for your sobering presentation. The question is, why aren't contractor deaths being made more public?
I think because of the political savings, essentially, of not being required. You know, we're not, no one is required to publish the deaths of contractors in the same way that there's a need for public recognition of troop deaths. They also don't receive the same kinds of financial benefits. Their families don't when they die, or the same kinds of medical care as veterans receive. So it's a way of hiding some of the costs, hiding some of the human costs in terms of deaths and injury, and hiding from public view the number of people going to war, since the contractor deployments essentially are not nearly as publicly recognized as the troop deployments.
Thank you. At this time, we have no more questions.
Heidi, I want to ask you something. That is, GAO had reported a couple of times that the books of the Pentagon are not auditable. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, the most recent audit, I can't remember if it was a year or two ago, they failed. The money cannot be tracked. And part of this is it goes through so many layers of contracting. And I don't think it's only because of contracting. I mean, the defense, you know, makes up 15% of all federal spending, more than half of all federal discretionary spending. So it's a massive budget. I think just from an accounting point of view, it would be difficult anyway. But then when you get into the issue of DoD hires contractors that, you know, don't have very rigorous reporting requirements in terms of showing where the money goes. And these prime contractors can hire subcontractors and further subcontractors. Many of these are subcontractors who are not US based companies, but are based in other countries, or are third country companies providing a service in the country of conflict. And so it becomes nearly impossible to track where the money has gone. And I think that's one reason that we don't have a lot of research on the contracting economy. And that's one reason that drew me into it. It prevented me from studying it for a little while because it's hard to find data, but it also drew me into wanting to study it because of the challenge and because it's understudied. And I think one of the reasons it's understudied is just it's very difficult to find data. And so the Defense Department, partly because of contracting as well as for other reasons, failed the most recent audit. I don't know if they've ever passed an audit. I don't know the historical record there, but it is, yeah, not auditable.
Trish, if you have any question, and of course I can ask a couple of more questions to entice people to ask more.
Okay, no questions right now.
I was asking you. This is very close to your heart also, what Heidi's talking about at MIT.
It is indeed.
One thing I wanted to ask Heidi, if Trish, you're not going to ask, are you going to ask something?
No, go ahead, Subrat.
Okay. Is that, first of all, thank you so much for doing this work on contracting. One aspect which is not so much tangible, but is, and I can only sort of speak anecdotally about it, is that this business of shrinking government started actually with Al Gore and his re-engineering the government thing back in the mid-90s when I was actually on the Hill. And so this whole idea, as you said, Heidi, is this sort of ideology that if you go in the private sector, you will get more efficiency. So you have demonstrated that, first of all, that's a fallacy, especially in the military, because there is no competition. But also what has happened, this is not just the DoD, it's also NASA. And starting with the Challenger crash and so forth, and when it was the launch decision was made by Mud Marietta, and then several other things that happened at NASA, and many more failures in the, I, of course, was the investigator from Congress on the fraud and the missile defense program, and investigated for 2 years. And I found when I interviewed very high-level Pentagon officials about this contract, they said, well, we don't have any answers. You got to go ask the contractor. So that whole thing with the expertise, in-house expertise of the government, which was so fantastic in the post World War II era, when science was booming, and the in-house laboratories from all of NASA, DoD, just really amazing laboratories doing amazing work. So you had these in-house experts who didn't have any conflict of interest. They didn't have to respond to the vice president for the bottom line for the quarterly report. So they could speak the truth and bring real oversight to these programs in the Defense Department in particular, but NASA also. And that is very much eroded now. I wonder if you have any thought on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And it's a section I had been working on including in the contractor paper that I ended up leaving aside because it was getting to be a bit too unwieldy otherwise. But it's the effects on national security, effect on the dependence of the military on contractors. So the dependence not only for their materials, but the increasing dependence in theaters of war, where now some of the weapons servicing is being done by contractors, the fuel supplies, things that are not just dining halls and other things that are provided by contractors that used to be provided by the military in-house, but things that actually are security related. So you have increasing numbers of private security forces that are actually doing some of the guard and security work in conflict areas, and that are providing fuel, and that are doing the servicing of the weapons. So you're limiting the knowledge that had been accruing or could be gained of the military itself to service its own weapons and to be self-reliant, and your increasing dependency on an outside contractor that doesn't have the same mission. Its mission is to gain profit. Its mission is to remain in business. Its mission is not the security of the United States, even though it might claim that that's the case. Its mission is it's a private or commercial company that has a mission to fulfill for its stakeholders and shareholders. And so there are instances where that mission and the mission of the military are in conflict. And when the military is increasingly dependent on outside contractors, that's actually a security issue.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have questions now, so.
Yeah, we do. And this is close to my heart as well. Professor Elizabeth Wood from our MIT is asking, what suggestions do you have for students, undergrad or grads? What are good topics for their research? And also, this is what I wanted to ask you. What can we do as citizens? So that's a two-pronged question.
Both very good questions. Well, I think there's a lot to be done research-wise, partly because there is how do I say this? The amount of transparency, the amount of data that we know now about the defense spending and homeland security spending, which is closely related, that has decreased in recent years, whether it's just because of this current administration or not. I'll leave that to you to decide. But homeland security spending has always been a very difficult thing to track, and I'm actually working on a project right now trying to look at homeland security spending and the spending related to terrorism since 2000. Well, Homeland Security was established, the department was established in 2003. But I think, there are lots of sort of data related questions to ask about defense spending and about homeland security spending. I think there are also questions that might be more political philosophy in nature. So what is the purpose of the federal government would be one of the questions. And the way that we're using our resources, if we were to answer that question based on our use of resources, we'd say the federal government is there to go to war and to spend a lot of money on what I'd call the security state. So I think there's lots of interesting research that can be done on these sort of interlinkages between the military and policing and other types of security. I think there are questions about the role of government and our attention to security at the peril of other types of public programs, public provision. And so then what can we do as citizens was the next question. We can try to influence our legislators to try to cut defense spending. So we can increase pressure on congressmen to decrease defense spending, increase pressure to reduce contract spending and reform contracting. And that's not an easy task. There have been multiple attempts over the past many decades to reform contracting. So it's not like there's an easy solution to this. Some have called for the nationalization of the defense industry. And this might be both something we can do as citizens and something that students can think about researching is, the nationalization of defense versus the privatization of defense, the commercialization of defense. Hopefully I've answered both of those questions, at least partly, but I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. Another friend of ours and a board member, Professor Jonathan King, is making a comment for you to reply or respond to. It's also important to realize that to maintain their war profits, the industry needs to convince the public of, parentheses, false war dangers, such as attacks from Russia, China, Iran, etc. The security state is one of the largest and most damaging boondoggles in our history.
That's right. And initially, when I was working on this paper, the title had to do something along the lines with how profits create a need for perpetual war. And this has to do with the economic driver for contracting, that it's the need to create a market or sustain a market or grow a market. And if your company's business is providing services in the theater of war, you want war to continue. Your profits rely on the idea of terrorism being out there, and we have to go combat it wherever it is, and we have to go find it all over the world. And so it creates new markets for defense contractors by propping up. You know what? If it's okay, I want to. There was one slide that I didn't share that I'd like to share. If I can go back to, is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I threw it in as sort of an extra, and I decided not to use it. But let's go back to it. Or let's go to it. So okay. So relative share of deaths in the U.S. This is the citations at the bottom. So if you look at terrorism, at the top line, less than 1% of deaths in the US over this period, 1999 to 2016. Homicide is greater than that, about 2%. Suicide, also about 2%. 60% of deaths are cancer and heart disease. And so this leads me to ask the question, if we're spending more than half of our discretionary budget on the military, and the main reason we're in the post 9/11 wars is to fight terrorism, and terrorism is responsible for less than 1% or about 1% of death in the US. Is this really the best use of our resources? And I'll stop that share now, and I'll mention one other statistic, which is that the opioid fentanyl killed 200,000 people since 2001, whereas Muslim extremist terrorism in the US killed about 100 people. So 200,000 people from a drug overdose, and 100 people from terrorism. So that might lead us to think we might not be spending our resources wisely. If and I'm not going to make the claim that the purpose of government is to keep people alive, but this idea of using the threat of terrorism to keep the Homeland Security budget high, to keep the DoD budget high, to keep the U.S. at war in order to keep profits of contractors high. And then I'll add to that the idea that that weapons need to be modernized, and the nuclear arsenal needs to be modernized, and you get increased pressures for spending on all of that procurement in addition to the war-related spending.
Thank you. I know you said that the government isn't, maybe people might think the government isn't responsible for keeping people alive, but in my mind, a government and a society are responsible for the well-being of their citizens. So Frank Johnson is asking, in making the comparison between jobs created in different industries, in particular military and education, there's no discussion of the transfer of those jobs. I'm a retired engineer physicist who transferred to education as a physics teacher, but there's a fundamental difference between the two. One deals with material objects, the other is based on personal relationship between teacher and pupil. In advocating such transfers, how do we deal with these differences?
That's a good question. So I'll talk about two things. One is the idea of transferring, and one is the idea of using funds differently. So the idea of transferring is that we could cut back on the military budget and transfer funds into something else, and transfer personnel into that something else. And there are some industries where that kind of transfer lends itself more readily. So infrastructure and clean energy are two examples where there's more overlap between the jobs that people do in the military and the jobs that people do in clean energy or infrastructure. So jobs like construction, for example, engineering, electricians, and actually the Department of Labor has a crosswalk. It's called ONET, O*NET, And they have a crosswalk for military occupations into other industries. And there's a green crosswalk as well. So you can look at military occupations into green occupations. And you can see where you put in an occupational code for a military person in whatever occupation they're in the military, and it shows the civilian equivalents for those occupations. And so some industries like infrastructure and clean energy, it's a neater crosswalk, if you will. Others, education's a great example, and I applaud you for going into that. But that's not as easy a crosswalk. That's not as easy a transfer of skills. And so here, what I would point to more is the idea of decreasing the defense budget over time, and in a way that allows us to increase budgets elsewhere, where it's not necessarily a transfer of personnel from defense to elsewhere, but preventing the continued increase of defense spending and shifting that potential job creation to potential job creation elsewhere. That's another way to think of it. Yeah.
How do we increase pressure when every state has a defense manufacturer, or almost every state probably, and Congress, the people in Congress are dependent on those votes and jobs?
Yeah, I think that is the trickiest problem of this all. And it was done very intentionally that defense contracts and defense contractors have subcontractors and supply chains throughout the country. So just about every congressional district has some defense related jobs. And that's not accidental. That makes it much harder for, it's easy for someone in general to call for a reduction in spending, but not in their own district, right? And so nobody wants to be the congressman who sees jobs decline in their own district. So I think it's a very tricky question. The one suggestion I would have there, and I'm sure there are others, the one suggestion I would have is to think about tying new initiatives, the funding of new initiatives, to areas that would be most hurt by a loss of defense jobs. So if we think of, for example, Green New Deal funding or expanding clean energy, and if we're looking at where to establish clean energy manufacturing plants, where to establish service centers and things like that, tying that kind of funding or locating that kind of funding in places that have a defense industrial base that will lose jobs will reduce some of the pressure and kind of bring people along into this transition.
Thank you. Thank you. And there are no more questions at this time.
Oh, I just saw there was one. No, is it already asked, Trish?
Oh, here is a new one popped in. The
Okay.
ONET site suggests that the military is continuously transferring retired personnel into other jobs anyway. Could that not be used also for showing that there don't have to be job losses?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
Yeah, the ONET site. So Elizabeth must have gone onto the site to look. It suggests that the military is continuously transferred retired personnel into other jobs anyway. So once they retire from the military, they shift over. Could that not be used also for showing that there doesn't have to be a job loss situation?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because military personnel tend to retire earlier than the rest of us. And of course, professors never retire, right? But the rest of most other industries where people do retire at some point, those retirements tend to happen later, and retirements are at a younger age in the military. So you get more of a still working age population who's retired from the military and going into civilian jobs. And that's a great point. That could be a way to show that this transfer is possible. It is already happening, and it could be amplified by reducing and shifting defense spending.
Thank you.
Heidi, I have a point. I don't know if were you familiar with the Massachusetts defense? Oh, this is way before your time, but the Massachusetts Defense Conversion Task Force that was formed in 1994. A lot of peace groups, academics, and so forth tried to look at, because of the impending drawdown of the defense at that time with Bill Clinton's second year in office, they were looking at, because companies were shutting down, and then use these fantastic facilities they had built up to try to use engineering talent to, I don't know if anything like that is happening anywhere, looking at using retraining engineers from defense to non-defense type work.
I don't know of any initiatives that are happening now. I mean, I know in the 90s there was a real push toward conversion that in essence went nowhere, partly because of these vested interests that pushed for more military spending and new markets, you know, the wars that we went into post 9/11. But there are various reasons that the so-called peace dividend didn't materialize, and the conversion that that some of us were hoping for in the 90s didn't happen. I don't know if there is any movement for a new round of that. I would certainly push for a conversion from military to clean energy, both because it's needed in terms of the climate, and because there really is a strong overlap. Obviously not a perfectly one-to-one overlap, but a strong overlap between military occupations and clean energy occupations.
Thank you very much. We are almost out of time, but we do, I think, have one more question. So we'll take that, and after that, we will end.
Yes, I see Frank Johnson, you've posted your name in the Q&A box, but a question is not appearing. But Elizabeth is asking another question. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Great, Professor Wood.
Have you talked about the misappropriation of congressional funds set aside for COVID to help build President Trump's wall? Is this an area where citizens can rally against congressional funding
Yes.
being misapplied?
Yeah, well, great point, great question. So there is, I think, before the Supreme Court as of now, a case for misuse of of military funds for the creation of the border wall. I don't really have any updates beyond knowing that this is happening and is being considered a misappropriation of funds. The other thing I will say that that's COVID related is some of you may know of the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, which is one of the stimulus programs for small businesses, intended for small businesses, businesses with under 500 employees, as a way to keep up employment during a time where they might otherwise lay people off. And there are, many examples of businesses that found loopholes to exploit that program and use that program that were bigger businesses. But there was also within that program and within the bigger CARES Act, the relief bill, there was funding explicitly for defense contractors, including non-emergency funds, including funds for weapon systems that were planned for future years from now, including for upgrades to their offices. And there are, I think, Pogo might have a report on this. I can't remember exactly where I saw the report, but there's evidence of some of the COVID stimulus funding going not to the individuals and businesses who are most hurt, but to defense contractors to prop up their own spending.
One more quick question, I think, and Heidi, this has been a fantastic program. Both of you, thank you. Frank is also thanking you, Heidi. Are you aware of the Lucas Aerospace campaign in the UK in the 1970s, which produced over 100 alternative projects to the military jobs that were being lost?
Oh, no, thank you for pointing that out. I am not aware of that, but I will certainly look into that. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And one more person, Subrata, is asking where they can get your background.
Sure. Well,
no, I'm sorry. They're asking about Subrata. We have
Subrata.
We have your whole website connected to our website. So Subrata is working.
There you go. There you go.
Subrata is working on a website.
I didn't mean to advertise, but
yeah. Yes, we'll be working on that. And I think that's probably it.
So thank you very much, everybody, for attending this very, very informative seminar and the discussion that followed. I'm really glad that people asked very important questions. And of course, Heidi's answers were very illuminating. So I'm very pleased, and thank to Heidi so much for doing this. I look forward to our future interaction. And thank you, everybody. With that, I think we'll say goodbye.
Oh, and I'm
And
sorry.
Heidi, if you need to say anything, sorry.
Yes,
I should give you the
I'd
last
like to.
word.
Yeah, sure.
Would
Thank
you like to close, Heidi?
Yeah,
Yes.
I'd like to thank Trish for hosting again, and thanks Subrata very much for inviting me to speak and for your questions and moderating today. And I look forward to being in continued contact with you. And I want to thank everybody who watched this live or who is watching the recording. And I'll welcome you to come to, if you're interested in contracting, to come on November 18th to the seminar at the Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. And again, if there's anything in here, if you access the presentation or the slides afterwards and you want to follow up with me, I invite you to send me an email, and I'd be happy to answer more questions. But thank you, everyone. And that's it from me. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.